Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn for today. Um, my name is Josiah Ilchenfritz. I'll be leading this afternoon. And let's go ahead and open up the floor to any questions. I hope everyone is having a great Monday and a good start to their week so far. All right. Any questions from our guests today? Question. What is the difference between a regular job and an interval schedule and an interval job? Which should I use? Okay. So there are two different types of entities that you can create, and the way they run is a little bit different. Let me pull up my decisions here, and I can show you what those look like. All right, so if we go down to the system folder here and the jobs and events, and under scheduled jobs, we'll have the normal scheduled jobs here and the interval jobs over here. Now, the main one that people typically use is going to be um, a scheduled job. And if I come in here to a scheduled job, I can give it the information about the job name, the flow that I want to run, and most importantly, how often that I want to do this. Now, one of the options here is a time span schedule. In here, it's going to ask me how often I want this job to run. So I can give it some information here, and it's going to give me a time here, and I can, let me just set up a job here really quick. This will work. I'll create this, and I'm going to say I want this thing to run every 30 minutes. And I can go ahead and create that, and it'll show up here, and it's going to give me a time when it's going to run. This thing wants to run at 12:02. Once it runs, it'll calculate a new date based on that interval that I set. So let's get this to update here. That should run shortly. And once that does, you'll see that. Now, while I'm waiting for that to run, I'm going to come over here and create a new interval job. The interval job, I can say new scheduled flow here. Same thing that I can set up here. I can pick a flow that I want to run. I can give it a start date. This is when it's going to start running that flow. I'm going to give it the calendar. Actually, hang on. I'm clicking the wrong button there. I don't want new scheduled flow because that's just a regular scheduled job. The thing here is the interval job. You'll notice that the setup is a little bit different. So here I'll say it's enabled. I give it a flow. I don't have a bunch of options around how often I want this to run anymore. All I have now is an interval. I'm going to say I want this to run on a 25-minute interval. It'll give me that. It'll give me this thing. Now, the big difference here between the interval job and the scheduled job that's set up to run on a time span is the scheduled job that runs on a time span why hasn't my job run? Is that the date that it gets calculated is it actually calculates a date and runs this thing based on a time. So even though I give it a time that says run this every half an hour, it really is running based off of this run when time. So this thing runs and then it calculates a new time that says pick me a time that is 30 minutes in the future of this time, and it will give me a new run when time. And then this thing will run every time that decision sees it hits that time, and then it'll run the job, come back, calculate a new time. The interval job doesn't actually have a run when time like that. It just says half an hour after this job finishes, uh, create a new one or run it again. That's really the big difference is how it calculates that time when it should run. And the underlying service, instead of giving it a date and then have something the job service that says have I reached that date time yet, it just says run this thing every half hour. It doesn't have that run when timestamp on it. That's really the big difference between them. Which should you use? It depends on your use case a little bit, I guess. I've never run into an issue. No, I'll take that back. The only time that I've run into an issue where I needed to use a interval job over the scheduled job on a time span was when there was an issue with a server setup and the time zone between the server and the database were off. Because of the way that time zone gets calculated, you can run into some issues. And this is kind of a scenario that isn't a good scenario anyway, because you don't ever want those two time zones to be out of sync. They should always be the same. But I had a customer who, for whatever reason, had them out of sync. And at the time, we couldn't get them back together until they did some other work. So the workaround was to use the interval job and say run it on this span instead of using the regular scheduled job. There's another question around scheduled jobs. Do they have the option to only run during business hours? Absolutely. So if I go back to my scheduled job setup here, and I'm just going to look at one of these, I can edit the scheduled job. Depending on the type of job that you set this up to run. So the time span isn't going to show me this option because of the type of job that it is. Let me create a new one here. Let's say I do a daily schedule here. I have the option now to specify which days I want to run this, and I can say respect business days for selected days. So if I've set up my locations to say this is a business day, or Saturday and Sunday I don't want to run it, I can easily just uncheck those. But I can also tell it if I've set up days and times to say this is a specific business time or a day when this location is open. I can actually specify that I want to respect those business days. So yes, we absolutely can have this to run during business hours.
So the location would have to have the business hours in it. Is that correct?
Correct. So you define business hours in a location. So if I were to go to under system and then system data, there's a locations in here. And you can define, there's the default location. I can define some test locations, but there's an action here to add a holiday. Basically, This is what lets you define when those business or non-business days are.
Right. Well, so we have it set for the days. So we have something that needs to run between 6:30 and 3. Only between 6:30 and 3 on business days.
Okay, so in that case, when you're setting up the scheduled job, what I think might work for you is if you said, on those business days, you've got to take into account business days. You could do like a daily schedule and tell it to run at 6:30.
Right, and so that's what we've got now is we've got a separate job for every 15-minute interval that we want.
Okay, so you want them. I see. So you want a time span job that you can just say run every 15 minutes,
but only between 6:30. Yeah.
But only be gotcha.
It doesn't seem to be a thing that we can find.
No, I think you're right. Let me make a note of that. I think that could be a really good feature request. On a time span, you could say, we want to do this every 15 minutes, but we don't want to do it. We only want to do it in this particular period. Because the other option would be specified. No, that just lets you tell it you want our job to run at a future date. All right, I will make a note of that. I think you're right. I think the way that you would have to accomplish it now would be to set up a job that runs, you know, every 15 minutes for that time, one for each of those time slots. But there's not a
Right.
good way to just say do it on that interval in this time period.
Okay, I just wanted to check and make sure we weren't missing something.
Yep, I will. I'll do some more digging and see if there is a way that we can do that. If there is, I will let you know.
Perfect.
Otherwise, I'll get a DT in for this.
Thank you.
Jeff, I just saw your note there. Would another way to look at it on the time span would be the job takes 5 minutes to run and you had 30-minute interval, would it run every 35 minutes where the interval would run the clock every 30 minutes? I believe that is correct. I believe that the interval job will always start up every 30 minutes. But yes, if it took 30 or 5 minutes to run, the next time it calculated that date would be 30 minutes after it had finished. So you would kind of get that little bit of an offset. All right, other questions? Anything else people would like to see about scheduled jobs, or if there's some other area that I can give some more insight into? The scheduled job setup can be performed by a flow dynamically. There are steps that allow you to interact with a scheduled job in a flow to do some work around that and make changes to it, create a new one, set it up. They're a little bit. Let me see if I actually have an example of this. I think that I might. Let's see. This flow does. Okay, so this flow has a form in it that has some setup around setting up a scheduled job. So you can tell it when you want the job to run, what days you want, if you want to respect the business days. This particular flow is set up around a daily scheduled job, but we can then update that thing. There's an object in decisions. This particular one is a daily schedule object, but we can get in there and see the properties of that thing. So we can say we want to define the hours that it should run, the minute, all of the properties that we see in that scheduled job. We can get at those and update those, and then using the scheduled job service, we can update the properties of that job. So if we go into steps and then integration and then internal services, and under that, we will be able to go down here to the scheduled job service. And here are all of the internal methods for working with a scheduled job. So you could build a flow and say, we want to add a job schedule. And now if we look at the data on this, here's all of the properties that we need around setting up that job schedule. So there's a lot of things that are configured in here that need to be kind of set up and configured. And that's why the process we've got here kind of operates on the assumption that it already has a scheduled job that's been created and it's just doing some minor modifications to it. But if you need to build a flow that will set up a scheduled job, turn it on, create it, enable, disable, change some of the settings, you absolutely can do that. And again, those steps are under the integrations, internal services, scheduled job service. Any other questions this afternoon? Is there still an issue with the interval job respecting the isJob server cluster setting? Jeff, I'm not sure on that one. I can certainly take that as an action to do some more digging around that and see if there is an issue with that. And if there is, get that in front of the dev team.
Oh, okay. I'm guessing that there probably isn't, since it's been a while since these jobs were introduced in a version, but I know we had some issues with that at the beginning. We actually had to disable them on one of the servers.
They were just running on all servers regardless of if the job server, if it was set as the job server or not.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, I guess we could test it. We could, well, no, we only have clustered servers in production, so that makes it kind of hard, but I just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, I'll follow up on that.
Okay.
What else would folks like to talk about today? All right, here's a question. What do we need to configure if we are using a throw exception step in a flow? All right, so the throw exception step, for those of you who haven't used it, is a way that you can make decisions jump to a catch exception step. If you've got a place where you actually want to cause the flow to act as if something had gone wrong, you can use a throw exception step to accomplish that. So what that looks like, let me create a new flow here. Normally we have a flow, and in here, if we have our error handling, we'll have a catch exception step. And the catch exception step will give us back all of this data about an error message. So we've got full trace, message, stack, type name, flow ID, flow name, step ID, step name. We can take all of that data if we were to pass it to a log step to write it to, the logs as we catch this exception. That's all great. But if we decide we want to use a throw exception here, let me find one of those. The throw exception step will allow us to say something's gone wrong here. We want to treat this as an exception case. Now, maybe a place where that might happen would be we have a fetch entity step, right? And we want to do something with the data, but we say if there aren't any results, that normally wouldn't be an error condition necessarily, but we want to treat that as if something had gone wrong. We want to throw that as an exception and get it picked up in our general error handling. Now, the throw exception step gives us one input here. It says we can give it a message. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to give this a message and say, found no results. I'll just connect my results path to there for now. And I'm just gonna pick this data type and I'll just set something here where I expect this not to return any data back. And then I'm going to go ahead and run this. And when it runs, you can see I went to my no results path, which jumped to my which routes to my throw exception, which now jumped to my catch exception. So if I had any type of error handling process in here, I can make this thing act as if this would have normally been caught by the catch exception. Now, one thing to note if you want to use the throw exception step is how decisions actually looks at the results that come back from the step. If I look at the data that's being put out by my catch exception here around what happened in the flow, right? Typically, this is going to tell me things like, where did the error occur? What step had an issue? What was wrong? All of that, all of that, which is still true. However, because I'm using that throw exception step, the thing that went wrong is that the throw exception threw an exception. And it actually, the error message here is, a little bit, can be a little bit misleading if you're not used to it. Because here, the exception type name, right? It says error running flow step. And the error is error running step, throw exception in flow, which technically is true. The throw exception threw an exception, so it's an error, but the step actually ran properly. So just keep that in mind. Like the error that you'll see here is that there was an error running the step in the throw exception. Now, the throw exception does have a place to provide a message, and you'll see that nested inside the error message that comes through here. So for example, we have the error messages, error running step, throw exception in flow, or in flow 2, and then here's the message that we gave it. Fetch entities found, no results. This is the text that I passed in. But the step itself, the throw exception and the catch exception, as far as it's concerned, the error came from the throw exception. It has no notion of the thing that happened right before that throw exception. So if you do decide that you want to use a throw exception step in your flow, it's really, really important that in that message that you give it, you give the details about the thing that you are considering the error scenario. Because otherwise, this thing, isn't going to tell you fetch entities didn't find any data, except that happens to be the message that's in here. So looking at the error stack here, nothing about this error stack is going to say anything about the fetch entities not working the way that I wanted to. If I look at the step that gave me the issue, it's not going to tell me that it was my throw exception. The step ID isn't going to tell me that. I have to kind of parse out from this thing where that error actually occurred. So a pattern that I'll typically use instead of the throw exception, if I want to treat this as if it were, I want this to go to my normal error handling. Let's say I've got a flow in here for error handling. I'll put that in here as a subflow, right? This will be my error handling flow. And I can actually put my, where is it? I can put my error handling flow in here if I can find it. I don't know where my flow went. All right, I'm just going to throw this one in here for now. Right, this is my error handling flow. For the sake of this, let's assume that this has all of my error inputs into it. What I can do instead here, instead of using this throw exception, right, if I'm saying from this catch exception, I'm passing in things like flow name, step name, exception message, exception full trace, I can come here and initialize that data and give it the value that I want. So I can say step name, and I'm going to give this my flow name. And now I can say my step name is going to be is that my flow name is flow2. My exception message is no results. And then I can plug that right into my error handling flow. As long as the inputs that I define here match the names of the outputs coming from my catch exception, that data will all get passed in here. But now I've got full control of the formatting for this. So when I run it and look at it, I can say, oh, here's these outputs. Now I know exactly what step actually gave me this issue. And I don't have to try to parse out of a big stack trace this nested message here that I may want to see. What other questions would you guys like answered today? All right. Well, that looks like it's all of the questions for today. Thank you all for joining. We'll be having another one Tuesday through Thursday for the rest of the week, and continuing going forward. So if you've got more questions, always let us know. We're always happy to answer. Have a great afternoon, everyone.